Destre is not only an active researcher, but also teaches courses on international humanitarian law of armed conflict, torture, international law, human rights, and climate justice. It is in his role as a DU professor where our paths intersected, and I'm going to choke up, I'm sorry. Our paths intersected in the person of Western graduate Monica Peterson, to whom this lecture tonight is dedicated. Monica graduated from Western with a degree in anthropology. She was a dynamic and bright student who had a passion for the world. Her innate curiosity about other cultures brought her to my Latin American history courses, to Lindsay King's anthropology courses, and we shared many a conversation in and out of the classroom. I think she's exactly the kind of student Paul Laudenschlager would have loved to have in his courses. Engaged, feisty, passionate about ideas, and full of questions. I was so pleased that Monica continued her education at DU under Dr. Destre's guidance at the Human Trafficking Clinic, which offers the country's only 2-year graduate level training program in forced and bonded labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, and international labor migration issues. Monica was truly a rising star in human trafficking scholarship and activism, and spoke on the topic to local, state, and federal authorities from Colorado to Washington, D.C. Tragically, Monica passed away last year while in Haiti researching human trafficking. Her loss has been felt by all who knew her and worked with her. This lecture addresses a timely topic which honors her legacy and continues conversations on our campus about pressing human rights issues. Tonight, Dr. Destre will present a part of Monica's final project and discuss some of the problems associated with the conventional ways of representing and understanding human trafficking. So please give a warm Western welcome to Dr. Destre.
So, first, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's always really good and proper to try and thank all those who make an event like this possible. The first invitation made many months ago at Monica's memorial service at the University of Denver, to the faculty and staff of the various departments who consulted about the proper time and place, to the Laudenschlager family who generously created this lecture, to those who have worked to publicize this evening's talk, to those who set up the room and are taping it. It also happens to include the people at the hotel where I'm staying and those who may have even served us dinner before we came here tonight. The list could go on almost really forever. This is the interconnectedness, the interdependence of all things. It is described sometimes as Indra's net. Now what you have to do is imagine a net as large as the universe itself. And at every point where the strands meet, there is a perfect jewel that reflects every other jewel in the net. What happens when one jewel is removed? Well, everything in the net completely changes. I am here and you are here because one of those jewels was removed. Her name, as you've heard, is Monica K. Peterson. And she is the mysterious woman referred to in the title of the talk tonight, The Other Side of Human Trafficking, the Life and Scholarship of a WSCU Graduate. Monica is that WSCU graduate. I'm here tonight to give thanks for Monica's work and her life. I'm here very specifically, not just because I was invited, but because I really wanted to give thanks to her professors who taught her so well and the community that nurtured her during her years here studying anthropology. We at the Human Trafficking Center and I personally are the direct beneficiaries of what you shared with her here. The victims and survivors of human trafficking are also the direct beneficiaries of the grounding she received here at WSCU. There's, of course, also a sadness in me being here. I would much rather continue to receive long emails from her, drop in 15-minute appointments in my office that would turn into an hour-and-a-half impassioned speech about injustice, feminism, development, economics, agency, ethnography, political ineptitude, and the criminal justice system, all wrapped together in a well-thought-out and researched diatribe. I'm here because Monica can't be. And I have to say, I'm always caught off guard when I have to refer to Monica in the past tense. But who knows? Maybe one of you will catch the Monica Peterson bug and carry on with her energy. At the outset, I have to note the odd mix of this talk. It's not purely an academic lecture about someone else's work. That is fairly easy to do, dry, or would put most of you to sleep, and it still might. But it is a mix of Monica's work, words, and my thoughts. It is about Monica's life and my relationship to her as a student, as a colleague, and as a friend. It is a thumbnail sketch to the inner workings of a remarkable and nuanced human being that cannot begin to be captured in our short time together. I'd like to start with a quote from David Bryan Davis, who some of you may know if you're historians. He's the Sterling, or now the Emeritus Sterling Professor of History at Yale University, and probably one of the greatest writers on the modern slavery movement and abolitionism, old abolitionism if you wish, in the United States. He wrote this in his book, Challenging the Boundaries of Slavery. And this is a quote that is at the top of my syllabus, and it's a quote that I put on the board as I begin my class on forced labor and human trafficking. I want you to think about it. And I was fortunate, I have to say, to be able to spend time with Professor Davis, who, for those of you who are, most of you are not in this case, who talk about what you can produce after you retire. He has a 3-volume opus that he started writing after he retired, which is probably even more of a legacy to his work than what he worked on before he retired. He says, all forms of slavery embody a profound and inherent contradiction, illustrating the most extreme form of attention we experience almost daily in more subtle or benign interactions of inequality. I refer to the desire to dominate another person until she or he becomes a willing extension of our own will, an instrument to serve our needs. I'm going to repeat that last part. I refer to the desire to dominate another person until she or he becomes a willing extension of our own will, an instrument to serve our needs. One could almost say that the concept of human trafficking or modern slavery is the natural extension, is the natural end point, right, of what we do to each other all the time. We try to bend people to our will. We do it through economics. We do it with our intellect. We do it by gender. And we do it by the country we live in. We walk around being individual hegemons, hoping to convince other people that our worldview is the right worldview. The natural extension of that, from David's perspective and my perspective, comes in the form of slavery. The very first thing I say to you students who are taking my forced labor and human trafficking course is this. I presume you are here because you are passionate about the topic. I don't want you to ever lose that passion, but what I do want you to do is to match that passion with intellectual rigor. And I give you that charge as well. You need to match your passion that you have with intellectual rigor. And no one took that on that charge more seriously and exemplified my call more than Monica. The more passionate she became on a topic, the more she doubled down on her research and scholarship, which in turn made her even more passionate and more assured. She was a force to be reckoned with. She left behind some remarkable scholarship, including the basis of my talk tonight. But I'll get back to that in just a few minutes. I thought perhaps that I should probably lay a very short framework for what we call human trafficking. Sometimes other terms are used synonymously, like forced labor and modern slavery, which are just two of them. And even those elicit significant debate in my field. So let me read from something from our taxonomy project here. That this is a taxonomy. Taxonomy is how we define terms, and it's a sport. It's a sport of sorts. It's an intellectual sport that happens in the social sciences. It's really important to know how we define terms. So I'm going to start with the international terms. Forced labor, according to the International Labor Organization, is as follows. All work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Notice it says himself, is written in 1930. From the Palermo Protocol that we refer to, the international protocol written in 2000, the definition is as follows. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. That's a mouthful that you have to wind up unpacking. The United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 defines a victim of human trafficking as someone induced to perform labor or a commercial sex act through force, coercion, and fraud. Those are important concepts. Except, and we may get to it later, maybe in the Q&A, except for minor victims of sex trafficking. It's the only exception to the force, coercion, and fraud. In short, a person who is forced in some way to work for no compensation. That includes subsistence wages. So what are subsistence wages? Wages that are just enough to sort of keep body together. I wouldn't even say body and soul together. An example of that would be a place where I spent a fair amount of time in India, in the Indian subcontinent. A laborer who is paid 30 rupees a day, which is about $1, is about enough money to buy rice and dal, rice and beans, to feed themselves and have enough calories to keep on living. 30 rupees a day, they're being paid, but that it is not considered to be real wages. That person could be paid equally well just in food, and sometimes they are. And maybe we should discuss some of this further in the Q&A time, since some of you might actually remember working or continue to work for your own family business or in a ranch or farm for no wages. Is that exploitive labor? Is that trafficking? The HTC, or the Human Trafficking Center, in its taxonomy project, came up with its own definition, which I will read, or at least the beginning part of it. We see slavery as a condition, human trafficking as process, and forced labor as the product, as interconnected but not necessarily synonymous. Sex trafficking, debt bondage, and ganche, child soldier, and other terms are subcategories of slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor. The terms are meant to be interlocking and supportive of each other. Why did we come up with our own terms rather than using the legal terms? Well, what we discovered is the legal terms are fine for the purpose of prosecution, which is okay with me. I'm a former federal prosecutor. Except they're terrible for doing social science research. Right? So what we went through was a process of trying to redefine a lot of the terms. And so we have 3 pages of all sorts of terms dealing with whether it's slavery, sex worker, prostituted person, migration, enganche, neo-bondage, arranged marriage. These are all terms that we need to define so that we have a better understanding of what this phenomena really looks like. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act also came up with something called the 3 Ps, now called the 4 Ps. They are prosecution, protection, and prevention. And later they added partnership. This was supposed to be a victim-centered crime. That's what the sort of the PR was about this. Something that never really happened, with the vast majority really falling always on the first P, on prosecution. There's very little in terms of protection and prevention. Some years ago, it hasn't changed that much, I did a survey of how many beds had been put aside for victims, specifically victims of human trafficking in the United States. I came up with less than 12. So it was supposed to be victim-centered. Talk about that a lot. It's supposed to be a cooperation between law enforcement and prosecutors and non-government organizations and victim service, and it's yet to get there. This was set up in 2000, so 17 years later, we still haven't begun to achieve even the 3 Ps. So, I suppose being cute, I had to come up with a response to the 3 Ps. So the Human Trafficking Center counted with what is now the 3 Cs, or actually now the 4 Cs, because we had to add, they added a 4th P, we had to add a 4th C. And those 3 Cs or 4 Cs are causes, conditions, and cures. And we added on to that collaboration and cooperation. Why is that important? From our perspective, why is that important? We could have used the 3 Ps, 4 Ps. Because the causes and conditions, before you know how to effectuate a cure, you need to know what the causes and conditions are. It's a basic thing that you hope that your doctor does, right? If you go in and if you went to your doctor and your doctor simply handed out the same generic medication to everybody who came into her or his office, you would call them a quack, wouldn't you? In the old days, you know, in the late 1800s, laudanum was used a lot for that purpose. So at anything you wanted, if you were feeling badly, here, have some laudanum, which actually was a wonderful cure for everything because, you know, you got a serious buzz off of it. That's putting it mildly. And by the way, addicted on top of it, but people usually didn't care because often they would be given to cancer patients, right? But you want to know what the causes and conditions are. So even if you were to look at sex trafficking in the Indian subcontinent is very different than how it looks in South America, which is very different as it looks in Eastern Europe, which is completely different as it looks in North America, United States, and Canada. So unless you know what the causes and conditions are, you can't possibly come up with the 3rd C, cure. And it was actually helpful to add the 4th C, which is collaboration and cooperation. I had to add the cooperation because some colleagues, especially in Eastern Europe, think of collaboration in not exactly positive notions. And this was the sense of saying, we have to have a process by which academic institutions, lawmakers, policymakers, law enforcement have to work together to craft this. And you have to actually turn to people who know how to do research, because the only way you know what the causes and conditions are is to go do research. In the field, research. You can't do it from the armchair of Gunnison or Denver or Washington, D.C. or Geneva. Not possible. Just not possible. And Monica knew that as an anthropologist. Now, I usually use let me see if I can get this thing working. I usually use a whiteboard for this next part, but I'll have to do it without that. So one way we like to easily understand a problem is by using numbers. It's a good start, but numbers and stories, every number has a story, and we often forget the story, right? And sometimes we actually overemphasize the story without looking at the numbers or at the data. So these work together, qualitative and quantitative, mixed methods, if that means something to some of you, if you wish. So in the past, I've used a kind of performance art piece that I call Trafficking by the Numbers. Now, I hope you won't be disappointed if I don't do the performance part, but rather the much shorter version I present to my students as a way to begin their critique of the human trafficking narrative. Again, I usually use a whiteboard because these numbers have lots of zeros to them, and people are impressed when you have lots of zeros after a number. So, the first number is 21 million to 27 million, a number that was just recently changed to 40 million. Any ideas what that number represents? Yes? That's right. So some of them, that 27 million is sometimes I refer to as the Bales number, Kevin Bales, who was one of the first people to write about this. This is the estimation of the number of human trafficking victims or modern slavery victims in the world today. Now, one of the things, and I won't go through the whole exercise with you, but one of the things I have to ask my students to get thinking going, where does this number come from? That's the question that needs to be asked. I can't answer your question. That's problematic. Okay. And recently, in the past week, it was up to 40 million. Without any explanation in the presentation, which was a combination of 3 organizations, including ILO and IOM, who I have worked with closely. And when I asked to see their methodology, I was referred to a link that would explain the methodology, and I came to a page, and all it says on the page is coming soon. Now, from an academic perspective, the methodology should have been sent out to me weeks or months earlier so I could look at it and critique it and understand it. I even got an email with that number saying, this is the new number, we basically demand this is what you now use when you talk about human trafficking. And I said, that's unlike, well actually I said other words in my office. Fortunately the door was closed and most of the students couldn't hear me, but they understood that something just had happened in my office. So I used more colorful language at that point. But we do play with numbers. That first number, 21 to 27 million. Now that also means that there are more slaves now than any other time in history. A famous quote that started with Kevin Bales. That's true. What's the other question you have to ask? How many people are we talking about here? Right? Certainly that exceeds the total number of slaves that were brought across the Atlantic to the United States. But the population is completely different. One has to be very careful about how you say things and how you use numbers. Second number, I'll go through these more quickly. 800,000 to 1.2 million. I won't start asking you. That's the number of people who are trafficked across international borders each year. That's not the number of people who migrate or immigrate across international borders. That's the number of people who are trafficked into slavery each year. I do have to tell this story. I was not going to tell the story. So I remember when this came out, I was in Vienna at the UN Gift conference, the international conference. The number had just come out. We had this nice social gathering. And in one corner was the US ambassador dealing with trafficking in persons. A guy I knew, well established with his entourage. In the other corner, literally in the other corner, was the crew from IOM, International Organization of Migration, also really experts in the topic. So I started off with our own US ambassador because I had read it as a figure that had come out of the State Department. So I went up to him and I said, by the way, I just heard you have a new number because they've gone up from like 500,000. There's this new number, 800,000 to 1.2 million. Where does this number come from? And he said, oh, we get that number from IOM. I said, great, they're here. And my friend, Richard Danziger, who runs that unit, is in the room on the other side. So I went over to the other side and I said, Richard, I understand IOM has a new number, 800,000 to 1.2 million. Where did you get that number? You want to guess? US Department of State. Oh. So I did the very undiplomatic thing of bringing the IOM group, one side of the room, over to the other side of the room. So I had head of IOM and the US ambassador on trafficking, and I said, can someone clear this up? You say you got the number from IOM, IOM says you got the number from State Department. To say that there was an uncomfortable silence would be putting it mildly, right? This is 2007, I still don't have the answer. Okay. The third one is a big one because it's got 9 zeros after it. It's 32 billion. I actually saw it yesterday in a video that somebody said it was 1.3 trillion. Anybody want to guess on that one? Just put a big dollar sign in front of it. That's supposedly the amount of illicit money made by the trafficking of human beings. That would put it, even at 32 billion, as second only to the illicit sale of drugs and ahead of the illicit sale of arms. And it is very profitable. Drugs get used once. Guns actually have a very short lifespan. Human beings, however, can be sold over and over and over again at incredible profit. The fourth number is 14,500 to 17,500. Right? I use that because everyone likes to point their fingers and say, oh, this is something terrible that's happening in Thailand or in the Gulf states or in Latin America. That's the number of people who are trafficked into the United States each year. Right? That's the US government's own official estimate, the number of people who are trafficked across the US border into the United States. And I mean trafficked. This is not illegal migration. Right? Which is a much bigger number. Okay? That's enormous. That's truly enormous. Again, we have a problem because the previous estimate was 50,000. All of a sudden, one day, I opened up my email and it had been reduced to 14,500 to 17,500. And why? Well, because the initial estimate came from the intelligence community, from the CIA. And they're not exactly keen on revealing their methodology. So then we have this new number. I think that's an important number, whether you consider the accuracy or not, because it reminds us that it happens here. I don't know what you do in Gunnison, but in Colorado, maybe what you do is, it doesn't happen here, it happens in a place like Denver. It happens here. Trust me, I know. It happens here. So we have to bring it home. We can't keep pointing our fingers elsewhere. There's an old saying from a group called Moral Rearmament that coined the phrase, remember, every time you point your finger at someone else, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. The United States is not free. And this does not even take into account the number of US-born citizens who are trafficked in the United States, a number of which we have no idea, 0 idea. This is the United States. Don't you think we ought to know about that? No research, no numbers, no idea. The fifth number is 50,000 to 100,000. That's extrapolated from the previous number. That's the number of what we estimate, that's a conservative number, of the number of people at any given time who are enslaved in the United States. 50,000 to 100,000. Now this is a big population, so if you go by percentages, it's not too many people. But I still think it ought to catch you. That still, in the United States, in 2017, a conservative estimate would be that at any given time in the United States, there are 50,000 to 100,000 people who are being trafficked, who are in bondage in modern slavery. Now the last number is 27,000. It's a number I drew because people always ask me, so what's the root cause of human trafficking? Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet. There's no one thing that you can point at. And you always have to be careful, because if I were to say, well, the root cause of human trafficking, and this would be actually accurate, is global poverty. But the downside of that is if I say global poverty, everybody's eyes roll up in their head going, well, there's nothing that we can do about that, so let's move on to something we can handle. Okay? But 27,000, it's still an important number, and that's a good number. That's a number that has been verified by a number of agencies, the United Nations, and the United States. That is the number of people who die each day in the world from malnutrition. Really? That's a good-sized town that dies every day from malnutrition. It means they do not have enough calories to sustain their lives another day and they die. This is a perfect feeder into human trafficking, isn't it? There are lots of other feeders, but this is one. Because if it's you or your children who are going to become this statistics of 27,000 people who die each day, men, women, and children, you do the inconceivable. You take that job that you know will put you in a position of bondage. You will put your children in that position because you're making the devil's choice, hoping against hope that they will survive, even if your other children do not. So let me say a couple words about some of the controversies in the anti-human trafficking world. Many appear in Monica's work as well. So the first big one is this division between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I'm one of those who says this was a fundamental error that when we started crafting and talking about this in the late 90s. And I have to tell you, I'm an old-timer in this. I've been doing this since 1998. That's not actually that long ago, but in the world of human trafficking, that makes me an old-timer. I'm an old-timer in other ways as well, but in terms of human trafficking, I've been at this for a long time. And that, I won't go into all the causes of that, except that at first it was all just about sex trafficking. And it was an interesting, strange marriage or bedfellows of a certain group of radical feminists, along with evangelical groups and conservative political forces. And that's all they wanted to talk about was sex trafficking, prostitution and sex trafficking. And we'll get to that later, and I hope it comes up in questions because we can have a debate about the conflating sex trafficking and prostitution. I'll give you a little hint that that's a big one we'll talk about in a second, okay? Or maybe later on. All right. So when we started off, and then we said, oh no, there's sex trafficking, and finally, through a fair amount of dialogue and argumentation, said, no, we actually have to look at labor trafficking too, with the assumption, of course, that the big problem was actually sex trafficking. Is it a problem? Of course it is. It's a very big problem. Don't want to demean that, but actually 78% of human trafficking in the world, including the United States, is labor trafficking, not sex trafficking. And yet the entire focus, for taking all the way from the movie Taken onward, is about sex trafficking, and the sex trafficking of minors, and the sex trafficking specifically of minor girls. So for a very long time, the 13-year-old Thai girl who was forced to work in a brothel became the poster child for human trafficking. And to this day, most people, and maybe you too, and it wouldn't be your fault, when they say human trafficking, what they're really talking about is sex trafficking, to the serious detriment of labor trafficking, and all those who are involved in it in the United States and around the world, including here in the Gunnison area. The other one is and I referred to it, is this sharp, this is where the knives come out, and you think we're all a happy family, we're not, is the group that calls themselves the abolitionists, which really annoyed me because I thought I was an abolitionist until I met, quote, the true abolitionists. The true abolitionists were made up of that group of radical, or what sometimes they may or may not be familiar with the term, carceral feminists, versus the sex workers who are represented by the liberal feminist group. So the abolitionist group would say that no woman willingly engages in prostitution. So all women, by definition, are trafficked. And there are no such things as prostitutes. There are women who are prostituted. Now, remember, now the language is, I'm being very specific because they only talk about women and girls, but never about men and boys who are also involved in this, ever. Right? On the other side, there are the sex workers and the liberal feminists who talk about this is labor, this is a job, this is something that we do, right? And I'm willing to bet that every person in this room has a very strong feeling about that. And it's dependent upon your upbringing, your religious beliefs, your moral and ethical norms, all sorts of stuff, the culture that we live in, how we think about that. We have a very confusing notions about sex and sexuality in this country, right? Now, Las Vegas is in the news, unfortunately, because of a mass shooting, but Las Vegas was like, in fact, there used to be, I think you can still find it online, I'm not suggesting you do, it's called alibi.com, so that you can go to Las Vegas and engage in all sorts of extracurricular activities that are available. For those of you who've been to Las Vegas, and especially those men in the audience, it doesn't take much walking down the strip to be handed out flyers that suggest other clubs that you can go to. The further away you get from the Central Strip, the more you get into other kinds of strip clubs where prostitution is the norm. And in fact, prostitution is thought of as a normalization and a normal profession that young women in Las Vegas high schools think about as legitimate. Dancing in the clubs, being a showgirl, being a prostitute, all co-equal possibilities in a place like that. Yeah. And if you think that Las Vegas, you have, I don't know if any of you spent time in New Orleans, which is truly the sex capital of the United States. There is no variation of sexuality and sexual acts that cannot be found and bought in New Orleans. The next controversy is what we call the rescuer-savior model versus harm reduction. And the vast majority of what we do with human trafficking, what is done by organizations, is the rescue-savior model. You go in, you bust down the door of the brothel, you recover the girls, and then you train them, or retrain them, or give them, okay. That is contrasted, that savior model, a model that I'll just be straightforward, I have serious problems with, and I can tell you that Monica hated with a passion, herself being a survivor, is balanced with something we call harm reduction model, which is more controversial and not as popular. Some of you know what harm reduction model is. You may not have encountered it personally. Needle exchange is a harm reduction model. Another more mundane, you know, when the parents say, to try to tell their kids, or the teacher tells the kids, please don't run with scissors, right? Okay. Kids ignore exactly what parents and teachers say, so kids will still run with scissors. So the harm reduction version of that is, okay, you're going to be running with scissors anyway. When you run with scissors, make sure they're pointing away from you. So harm reduction model is, from my perspective, it takes more intensive, it is not morally and ethically laden. In Denver, you've been there to the 16th Street Mall. Perhaps you have never been there late at night, or you haven't seen what I now see, and inescapable for me to see that the tourists don't see, or you might not see when you're hanging out, which is all the street kids who are there late at night trying to find a place to be. And if you go down or look down, carefully down the dark alleys, they're there. And many of them are down the alleys having sex for money. Something we refer to as survival sex for a purpose. So if you take some 16-year-old boy who is engaged in the commercial sex trade off the 16th Street Mall and is turning 20 tricks a day, that's not unusual, to make money. And you go up to him and you say, you must stop this immoral, illegal activity now. And unless you're willing to do that, we are not going to help you. What do you think he's going to do? Walk out the door. You have no idea why he's there, how he got there, what he's doing to survive. He is doing what he needs to survive. The harm reduction model would suggest, so you're turning tricks every day to survive, which means food, shelter, drug addiction potentially. How about, like needle exchange, by the way, are you using condoms? And if not, here. Or once you have them on board a little bit, can we have a discussion of maybe reducing your 20 tricks a day to 15? Maybe charge your client a little bit more so you're not financially distressed. That's harm reduction. And I can see in your faces, I can already see in your faces some moral outrage. That's terrible. He shouldn't be engaging in homosexual acts in an alleyway to support himself in this drug habit. But it's not just his drug habit, right? Do you think he's there because he wants to be there? Do you think he's there because he comes from a wonderful, whole, complete family situation? No. He's there surviving. And you might not ever believe that you would be in that position. None of us are more than 2 or 3 degrees away from homelessness, let alone these kinds of issues. The next one is that the Palermo Protocol, I've referred to at the United Nations, interesting enough, is housed at the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and not in the Human Rights Agency. I'm just going to leave it at that. And that's been a big deal for many of us. And the Palermo Protocol is a protocol because it's a subset of a larger drug convention and treaty, right? Why isn't it in human rights? That also explains a little bit why it's almost used purely as a prosecution tool as well. The other is that the Palermo Protocol continues the infantilization of this. Let me read to you the full title of what we call the Palermo Protocol. It's law. The protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. There's no men in there, but notice that language, especially women and children. This unfortunately happens on a regular basis in human rights because they're the same, right? The issues that affect women are the same that affect children. The solution for the issues that affect women are the same solutions we can use for children. In reality, what it does is it says reverse that in a sense. What it's saying is that women are children. And this is an ongoing problem that affects you at the very core. This is written in 2000. Don't you think we should have known better by 2000? Clearly not, because that systematic understanding of the vulnerability of certain groups that we simply glom together in an undifferentiated manner. So thinking that one size fits all. Human trafficking does this all the time. We can also have a discussion maybe afterwards. What constitutes a child? 18? Well, we know that that's not true in labor laws, not in the United States, not in the military. In international law, you can start recruiting at 15 to 18. How about marriage? What's the youngest you can get married in the United States? Anybody know? 14. Some places with certain possibilities as young as 12, but 14. With permission, of course, of your parents. 14? And we are pointing our fingers all around the world decrying child marriage as a form of human trafficking. Some of you got married at a young age. I did. I thought I was an adult at 18. Of course, so did you, right? Or you do, I think. We also know, by the way, just as a side benefit, is that emotional maturity doesn't happen until around 27. I remind my graduate students of that, because they really think they're adults. So, then we get to the issue of the Trafficking in Persons report, which is one of the, that the United States government puts out, which is one of 3 what we call blame and shame reports. We put out a human rights report in which we critique the entire rest of the planet in terms of their human rights record, but of course we don't critique ourselves. We have a second blame and shame report that critiques religious freedom around the world and how that is working, but we don't critique ourselves. And now we have the Trafficking in Persons report in which we critique the entire world. And I was one of the people who lobbied, finally successfully, to have the United States include itself in the assessment. Boy, was I nutty, because we put ourselves, it's got a tier system. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 2 watch, and Tier 3. The bottom is really the bad guys. Truly the bad guys, you'll notice happen to be our national enemies are all back down there. And all our allies are at the top. And guess what? What tier we put ourselves in? Tier 1, and at best, we're a Tier 2 country. At best. Because we have the resources. We certainly have the laws, and we have the resources, but we refuse to somehow expend those resources on the solution to the problem, or making it available to the victims and survivors of human trafficking. So, into all of this, a new book enters the market. In 2009, it's by Siddharth Kara, you might have seen it, titled Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery. And it arrived at my desk shortly before the new academic year, and to my everlasting regret, I assigned it to all my students in my forced labor and human trafficking class because it came with a great recommendation, I won't say who, from a close friend and colleague. I didn't even bother to notice that the proceeds from the sale of the book would partially benefit his organization. This is not something I had ever done before, and I promise you I will never do again. As I read the book, I became more and more alarmed at the shoddy or non-existent research methodology and scholarship, and the half-baked, grandiose statements and conclusions. I thought maybe it was just me, so I checked in with my students at the time that was a required reading. Everybody was reading it in class as an assignment, and to a person, they agreed with my assessment. Within a short time, the book garnered wide acclaim, and the author lauded with awards and positions from truly world-class institutions. I, on the other hand, withdrew the book not only from the required reading list, but from any of the recommended reading lists that I have available. 2 years later, Monica walked into my class and into my life. 3 years later, she produced her first draft. And unhappy with her own analysis, she produced the final draft in April of 2016. So next time you're asked to do a book report, these 134 pages are in response to a 283-page book, of which she offers a finely articulated analysis, critique, and thought, which constitutes almost a summary on Monica's thoughts about human trafficking, and really represent the best of the scholar, practitioner, advocate mind. Her paper is entitled, "What Are We Saving Women From?" italicized, and "What Are We Saving Them To?" italicized. A gender and development analysis of the business of sex trafficking, the Korbel. So I'm going to read to you the introduction of this. It's already 7:30. See, it begins this way. When I began a master's degree at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver in the fall of 2011, I'd never given more than a brief passing thought to what human trafficking meant. Ironically, I was fully unaware that the Josef Korbel School offered the only 2-year graduate training program in the world on the subject of human trafficking and forced labor. Korbel had a comprehensive list of many different organizations, programs, certificates, and activities for students to be involved in. But the Human Trafficking Center wasn't on my radar. I had picked the Korbel School to study global poverty and slum development in the third world. Holding a bachelor's degree in anthropology, I came into my graduate program knowing I wanted to study and understand the place and space of acute global poverty. I was particularly interested in the human condition in slums, shantytowns, squatter settlements, and refugee camps. I needed to know why these were happening. There was clearly deep suffering and entrenched oppression, but as an ethnographer, I was more drawn to the human agency and adaptations within places of severe poverty. I also came into my graduate program concerned about the socially disadvantaged position of women around the world. I needed to understand why this was still happening. From the beginning, my graduate studies were concentrated on gender and reproductive rights. By the fall of 2012, I decided I would not go to Washington, D.C. for the quarter, as I originally planned through Korbel's exchange program. Instead, I would stay in Denver, which meant I would take one class in particular that was only offered fall quarters at Korbel. The class was INTS 4987, Human Trafficking and Forced Labor, with Professor Claude. I chose the class merely as an elective class for my degree requirements. I had no intention of pursuing the subject matter beyond this one elective class, as it didn't fit into what I saw as my career path at the time. Remember that as a lesson. I came into class without an agenda or the biases that inherently emerge after spending time in any field. I held no strong opinions one way or the other regarding human trafficking. I seemed to fall backwards into my research and field work on trafficking, and so my pedagogical process became an inductive approach from the outset. Around the 5th week of the fall of 2012 quarter, Professor Destray was honing in on his most impassioned plea to students who would work on human trafficking and forced labor. Sound Methodology. He held up Siddharth Kara's first book and passed around a copy of Laura Augustin's Counterpunch article, which wittedly called out Kara for the illogical research conducted in sex trafficking inside the business of modern slavery. I suppose I should do what I did then. This is what not to do in this field, said Professor Destray. This type of research is everything that is currently wrong with understanding of human trafficking. Now, I was interested. Augustine was also an anthropologist who not only spoke my own native language of methodology, but she had summed up in Kara's research a problem endemic to all international development initiatives in the Third World: saving the primitives from themselves. With a BA in anthropology and 1 year of grad school under my belt, I had a solid handle on the importance of comprehensive methodology to international development. I asked Professor Destray if I could write my final paper for his class as a critique of Kara's methodology in Inside the Business. She wrote that. I suggested that maybe, having taken just one look at it, this was something that ought to be published. She had no idea. She had another idea in mind for her master's thesis. And for the next 3 years, she put heart, body, and soul into this paper. It's more than a paper. Even in her executive summary, she begins with a hard-hitting sideways critique. You'll like this, I think. She refers to Kara's book as a novel. Now, a good novel is a very fine thing indeed, but we recognize it usually as a work of fiction, even those, quote, based on real events or inspired by real events. But Kara claims his book to be one of fact, an analysis of facts. Monica summed up Kara's works perfectly in one word: novel. So, let me continue to read something from, this is hard because I was trying to distill 134 pages of something that has already been distilled from probably about 500 pages, that she distilled at my insistence down to a mere 134 pages. And then I'm trying to distill for you this evening is tough. The idea of sex trafficking captivates attention almost instantaneously. Its enigmatic nature evokes imagery that is dangerous but curious, sexy but wrong, dirty but hopeful, an endless list of contradictions and questions of modernity. It has become one of those most emotive topics of the 21st century. As stories of modern-day sexual slavery began to surface in the 1990s and have continued to rapidly spread over the last decade, Siddharth Kara encounters this reality in his 2009 book. Predicated as the, quote, first ever business analysis. Now this is actually important because his academic background is, he has an MBA. He has no training in economics, no training in social sciences, let alone anthropology or sociology or any of the others. Okay? So it's the first ever business analysis of sex trafficking. The book seeks to explore economic depths of the sex trade while uncovering why this phenomena has become seemingly global, a global aspect of human nature. And it goes on. Then she launches into a 21-page devastating critique of his research methodology, starting with his lack of training and lack of any kind of institutional review. Those of us who do this work know we have to have something called an IRB approval, an institutional review board. Anytime that you work with a human subject, you have to go through a fairly rigorous process by which you get approval to do so. Kara did not feel the need to do so. He probably didn't even know what an IRB was. He wasn't at an academic institution. He is now at Harvard, my alma mater, I'm ashamed to say. But he certainly didn't then. No institutional approval, no IRB approval, so he went willy-nilly to deal with and interview some of the most harmed victims and survivors one can think of. She goes on to say what may be obvious. Flimsy research methodology will only produce unreliable data and subsequently unreliable interventions, and can have the reverse effect of making things worse, not better, for women vulnerable to being trafficked. Indeed, the whole point of sound research methodology is to produce reliable and transparent data so that international organizations, non-governmental organizations, law enforcement, government agencies, and lawmakers can produce rational policy. Junk science produces junk policy. The other expression is expletive in, expletive out. Yes, you've heard that one. It's ever so much more true with this. She notes how difficult it is to gather data on illicit markets, and even more so on hidden populations like this one. As difficult as it may be, there are time-honored research practices developed over many, many decades in the social sciences, including anthropology and sociology, that are either willfully or ignorantly ignored by CARA. Data is seemingly drawn out of thin air and coupled with really grandiose pronouncements. She reminds us that science-based studies must be amenable to some form of replication and empirical testing. That doesn't seem possible with CARA's work. I think that Monica was particularly incensed by CARA's interview techniques, if you would even call them techniques. CARA seemed to violate every principle and method taught to her as a budding anthropologist and ethnographer, and later field researcher. She describes a wide array of possible interview techniques that would have been available to CARA, and is concerned that none of the 270 reported interviews gives any description of the most basic information like ethnicity, class, age, gender, occupation, country of origin, or the location of the interview. Nor is there any sign that he is aware of or uses any established qualitative measurements. When he does use translators, there's no indication that they are trained in social science interviewing. In India, he uses his own, and he admits to it, his own rudimentary Hindi for interviews, and would often resort to hand gestures in other countries. He even admits that, quote, during my interviews, at times I had to prod and suggest answers more than once to extract data. I can almost visualize Monica's rage when she read this. Monica understood, as I do, that CARA is not a social scientist, and so it may be unfair to superimpose our criteria on him. However, he publicly seemed to accept the mantle of social scientist, and his book was accepted as if it were social science. Perhaps in the Q&A we can explore why, but I want to contrast CARA's book against another very popular book of the time. 2008, just before, a year before CARA's book came out, Benjamin Skinner wrote a book called A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern Slavery. Some of you may have read it. It also received wide acclaim, but no one thought to use it to craft policy and law. What was the difference? Ben Skinner is a journalist, and his book, while sometimes telling very powerful stories, does not masquerade as social science, but simply the work of a very good investigative reporter. I can also contrast Ben Skinner with Nicholas Kristof. I'm a fan of his, the New York Times, but that would be best left to another time. I realize I have much more to say about Monica, but we need to leave time to talk also, answer questions. She's concerned, I'll do it briefly, she's concerned with the problem of essentialism that is evident in CARA's work. So what is essentialism in this case? Essentialism may be understood as the, quote, static conceptualization of women as homogeneous, undifferentiated group whose conditions was determined by their sex. In other words, let's just clump all women together, especially third world women together, and treat them as if they were a single entity with no differentiation. That is evident through almost every page of the book. And to say that his language is condescending would be putting it mildly. He presumes that these are women who have no agency and cannot give consent by the fact that he simply puts together foreign woman plus sex work equals trafficking, amongst other things. I'm now going to skip through a fair amount here. The other issue that comes up, of course, is that CARA's book also ignores the rise of something called romance tourism. Because she's only talking about, now you may not know what romance tourism is. Some of you may. So we have sex tourism and we have romance tourism. Sex tourism, you know, right? You've read about. It's men getting on charter planes to go to Thailand to engage in the commercial sex trip. What's romance tourism? It's the same thing, but it's women traveling to other parts of the globe to buy sex with men. But that's romance tourism, not sex tourism. And it's not the same thing. Other than the fact that romance tourism is also very highly racialized. They talk about the milk runs from Canada and Europe that go to Jamaica, or the romance tourism in Goa in South India. And it's a growing phenomenon. But there's hardly a word, there's hardly any study, and hardly a word that equates, that says the terrible stuff that men engage in called sex tourism, right, because of their lustful, unbridled natures, is not the same as romance tourism. Just look how we've tried to reframe it, or was tried to reframe romance tourism. Okay. There's no possibility of making that kind of equation. Monica also goes into the whole issue of concepts of consent and agency, which I wish I had the time to go into detail with you. What constitutes consent? What is agency? What evokes agency? We presume that someone who was in a situation of human trafficking has been diminished completely of their consent and their agency. Often, nothing further from the truth. People on a regular basis leave untenable situations to go to worse situations, knowing that it's a worse situation, but where they are has no hope. And you go with the possibility that it might get worse, right, before it gets better. And this happens all the time. Laura Augustine has an online book. It only costs you $2.99. I would recommend that you download it, right, from Amazon. It's called The Three-Headed Dog. It's a novel. It's a crime novel. And yet it is filled with all these wonderful nuances. The protagonist is a woman who owns a bar, who is also a detective of sorts, and she works on some of these issues, who herself at some point in her career clearly has engaged in sex work. And she deals with people who have come to her country all the time from dead-end places to live into terrible situations. And yet, that takes, I like the Yiddish term, that takes chutzpah. People who travel 2,000 miles to come to the United States to find work so that they can send money home to support their families have agency. Women and men around the world take jobs that you and I would never consider, including sex work. They have families to feed. They have bills to pay. And Kara and his like simply ignore the enormous agency and consent that is involved in this. So, I'd be happy to share, by the way, Monica's whole paper with you. Why is all this important? Monica's long critique that I still need to find a place to publish, because people need to read this. Why is it important? It's important because this work has a direct effect on the lives of human beings. A direct effect. If you follow Kara and set your policy according to Kara, you go off in one direction and continue to perpetuate a system that denigrates not just women, but men. That is a system that puts both the trafficker, by the way, and the trafficked and the trafficker in the same untenable situation. I'm happy during, when we have a little bit of time to chat a bit, is to the number of times that I have met former victims of trafficking or them now themselves trafficked. This is actually a fairly common issue in brothels. The madam of the brothel herself was trafficked at one point. What is she? Is she a victim? or she had perpetrated. A couple last notes about Monica, and I know I've gone on too long. Personal notes. Noted that she was, I noted that she was the assistant to the director. This was her choice. She came to me one day, basically, this is typical Monica, so these are little stories, and told me I needed an assistant. I desperately needed help. She was the person for the job. I didn't even have a chance to say yes or no. She had already come in with a long list of ways to make the Human Trafficking Center better and to improve my lectures and I think she was willing at some point to probably get into my personal life and make suggestions there as well. We never quite got that far. She was, as heard, I'm on the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, and I got her and brought her on board on my task force on research and data because her voice was needed. Why was her voice needed? Because she was one of those voices that she and I were the voice, not just in research and data, but the voice of the people who were not allowed to be at the table, primarily of which were sex workers and kids. When I'd be sitting at the table, she wasn't allowed at the table, she had to sit in the audience. When Monica was there, my phone nonstop buzzed with texts about what I should say next. Okay. Whenever there was a legislative hearing at the Colorado Assembly, that dealt with human trafficking, I could always count on Monica to come up with, shall we say, a strongly worded response to the half-baked, half-assed ideas that our politicians would come up with to deal with the issue of forced labor and human trafficking. I should have brought it. When I told Monica that I needed to rethink my syllabus, which was, I thought, a little bit out of date. It was long enough, it was 6 pages. And I said, we should sit down and have a chat about this. 2 weeks passed, and I thought, well, we should set up time. So I set up the time, She came in with a 16-page syllabus. 120 required readings that the students should read in 10 weeks. And annotated bibliography on every one of those readings. It is the syllabus I use today. And the course is dedicated to her at the top of the page. The other thing was dogs and kids. She was everybody's nanny. She was a professional nanny, but she was also everybody's nanny. My office was always filled with stray dogs that she would adopt. And I'd like to think they were not stray kids, but seemingly endless supply of children I'd never met before coming through my office. She treated dogs and kids equally, better than me, because she had a heart, truly. You want to talk about somebody who had a heart of gold and a smile on her face all the time? That was Monica. She was so full of life, so full of energy, so passionate, and so smart. And then all of a sudden, she announces to me one day, I'm going to Haiti. Oh, really? Have you thought this through? Actually, not much, but she had been there many times. She wanted to continue working on trafficking in Haiti, but you know what her dream was? She wanted to go to Haiti, and if you want to see a working disaster, it is human rights and development organizations in Haiti, who simply divvied up the place willy-nilly to the detriment of the Haitians, right? So she went and said, I'm going to solve this. So she decided that she was going to open up this kind of big hotel/hostel that all the different NGOs would come and live there and stay there and talk to each other. She got herself a job. She had to pay the bill. She got herself a job at a prestigious elite prep school. She could have lived comfortably in their compound, but instead she chose to live in a very hard scrabble area of Port-au-Prince to set this process up. And then I got the phone call, and she was gone. She was gone. And I'm left with her memories, as some of us are. And I'm left with this. what she reminds me of is that a life well lived in service to others, however short, matters. Monica's dreams mattered. They mattered because they're our dreams.